I still remember the first time I held a fencing manual in my hands. I flipped through it, found the first technique pretty quickly, and immediately started trying to understand it. And of course, after a short while, I thought I understood how it worked. So I went to my coach at the time and wanted to show him what I have figured out. We drilled it, refined the technique, rethought the interpretation, and then in my first sparring session, it just didn't work at all. No matter how hard I tried to force the technique, it never felt like a real skill. It felt like luck, like a coincidence, but not like something I could actually control and apply on purpose. And then 6 years later, after countless hours of training, tournaments, and way too many YouTube videos, I came to realization I actually had no idea what I was doing. And back then, neither did my coach. But why was that? And more importantly, what would I do differently today? That is exactly what this video series is about. Because today I want to talk about something that has mostly been a side note on this channel so far, the sources. And I want to share why on this channel historical sources always play a secondary role. Because the problem I just described is, in my opinion, deeply rooted in the Hema community. And that is also because it is closely tied to how the community started in the first place. At its core, it was a bunch of sword nerds saying, we want to do this properly, often with a very clear contrast in mind. We don't want to be like Olympic fencing. So people studied the sources, translated them, interpreted them, and tried to rebuild fencing from the texts. And back then this was a proper way to do it, because there wasn't really anything like that around for what we have seen in modern day Hema today. But today that is exactly where the mistakes begins, because this behavior still sticks to the Hema community to this day. In my opinion, the order is wrong, because if you start reading sources before you can actually fence, you're not really going to understand them. It's like reading a book in a language you do not actually speak. And that is why I want to explain in 3 points why I believe it makes much more sense to learn fencing first and only then go deeper into the sources. Before I can really learn and apply techniques cleanly, my body first has to be capable of performing those movements correctly. If I lack mobility, stability, strength, balance, or coordination, problems show up immediately. And those problems stop me from doing the exercise in the way they were actually meant to be done. And that is a very important point. Not every technical weakness is automatically a technical problem. Very often, the real cause lies much earlier, in the body itself. If, for example, I cannot sink low enough, if my shoulders are unstable, if my hips do not move freely, or if I cannot maintain proper body structure and tension, then I will perform many fencing movements somehow, but I will never truly master them. That is why athletic competence is not a bonus. It's not just a nice extra, it is a requirement for a solid foundation. I first need to fix the physical limitation that prevent me from moving in a clean, controlled and repeatable way. That means before I swing the sword in a way that is useful, I need to learn footwork and body structure first. 2 things rarely seen in sources, especially in longsword sources. Only then I really can build up my techniques. Because fencing does not start with the blade, fencing starts with the body. Anyone who has looked at historical sources will notice pretty quickly that many things are treated as obvious. In other words, there are things you already expected to know before the sources even start to make sense. Things like body mechanics or footwork, for example. Those 2 things barely explained, if they are explained at all. Not because they are unimportant, but because they were probably assumed to be basic knowledge. And when a source includes illustrations, I think it is a mistake to treat those images as a direct template for your own fencing. Because first and foremost, those illustrations are art. They are not precise motion studies. Very often they are shown only a single moment from a continuous movement. The beginning is missing, the end is missing, and everything in between is missing too. On top of that, you always have to consider how things were represented visually in a certain historical period. Then you have artistic freedom on top of that, and in some cases, we are not even fully sure whether the image and the text were originally meant to go together. And that is exactly why I often found sources without pictures easier to understand than sources with pictures, because images create a bias. They push our interpretation of the text in a certain direction and not necessarily the right one. So to me, sources should never be the complete lesson. They are a supplement, a tool, but in my opinion they should never be a foundation of a whole training process. And that brings me to the third point. To really understand the source, I need to understand the fencing concept the master is trying to teach. And for that, it's not enough to just copy individual techniques. In many cases, the essential part of a manuscript is often the introduction or the parts that are built around the actual techniques. But to understand them, you need to learn a certain technique, learning to read between the lines. If someone performs techniques exactly as written in the sources, without understanding and applying the principles behind them, then in my opinion, that is not really fencing, that is called reenactment. Because at that point, I'm only trying to imitate, I'm not actually learning how to fence. One example that has really stayed with me comes from an earlier video I made about thrusts. There I talked about a passage from the Schielhau in the manuscript 44A8. By Peter von Danzig. The text basically says that if my opponent stands in Pflug and I want to thrust to a lower opening, you should strike the Schielhau to the chest. Now you just can copy that piece one to one and say, alright, in this exact situation I do this exact technique. But it only becomes really interesting once you realize that behind this piece there is a bigger principle. A principle that shows up again and again in many other pieces. And the principle is actually quite simple. Whenever my opponent takes a low guard and wants to attack low, I can extend myself and strike or thrust high to head or chest. Because in that moment, he cannot physically reach me. And once I understand that principle, everything changes. Then the Schielhau is no longer just a single technique from a source. It becomes an answer to a certain fencing situation. And suddenly, instead of the Schielhau, I might also use a Scheitelhau or a thrust, for example. Because I'm no longer just copied the technique. I understand the principle behind it, but to do that, I first need to know that fencing situation at all. I need to have trained it, I need to have applied it, I need to have experienced it myself, because only then I can really understand a piece like that. And that is exactly the point where sources suddenly become incredible valuable for your own fencing. Not at the beginning, but later, once you already have the necessary experience to actually understand what you are looking at. I hope this gives you a bit more background on why I used the manuscript as a secondary source. And in the future I also want to make a video where I break down specific passages in manuscripts that fundamentally change the way I understand fencing. So I would love to hear your thoughts, write them in the comments and let me know whether you enjoyed this format.